I think we will share most of the slides, and yeah, we are. I can see that we are registering everything anyway. Yeah, okay. So let's go. Hello everyone. So welcome to the workshop and roundtable about the sanitary effect of what we call the metaverse. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Jean-Marie Burkhardt. He's a senior researcher at the Gustav Eiffel University in the Applied Psychology and Ergonomics Lab. He has been working on VR for more than 20 years, if I'm correct, and is active in different ergonomics, psychology, and extended realities association. And he was coordinating a report on the sanitary risks of AR and VR, and this is what he's going to talk about. So, Jean-Marie, the floor is yours, and every time you need to change the slide, tell me. I'll do it.
Okay, thank you, Alexis. So I'm very happy to be here in order to share some of the work that has been done in the context of the French Agency for Food, Environmental and Occupational Health and Safety. As you say, you're correct. I started to work on virtual reality with Philippe Fuchs in 1997. So it is just a few more than 20 years. Okay, please do not hesitate to say to me to stop if I told too much. Okay, so I will report on the work that have been done and that were done in the context of the working group at the ANSES. First slide, please. This work was motivated in 1910 by the development of new virtual reality and augmented reality technologies. And at this moment, and it has been confirmed very lately, we see they saw the agency saw the increasing diffusion to consumer of items from the VR domain, and an increasing use of this technology also in the workplace. At this time, it was much more in the lab than in the real vocational site. But since this period, it has been also developed in the workplace. There were previously to work on expertise and opinion reports at NSERT in 2011 about the use of 3D game consoles for children, and also a working group on health effects of 3D visual technologies in 2014. So at this time, it was suspected many health effects related to virtual reality and augmented reality. And there were some prescriptions by manufacturers without few, if sometimes any, underlying scientific arguments. For example, side effects like visual fatigue, nausea, dizziness, etc. So next slide. In 2017, the agency did an internal request in order to have a collective appraisal about health effects for these technologies. Multidisciplinary working group have been created in March 2018, which mixed people from the research on ophthalmology, physiology, ergonomics, psychology, otorhinolaryngology, and social sciences. We were in this group 12 members, and we had 27 plenary sessions The work that has been done in this context was first a literature review on the various effects, interviews of scientific experts and other individuals. For example, we had an interview with representatives of the Union of Leisure Software Publishers. And we had also organized two external contributions. One, which was a survey on how the French population, general population exposure to virtual reality and augmented reality technologies, and also some physical measurement of various VR and AR devices, which has been done by the CSTB with the French agency on this topic. In particular, we looked at electromagnetic field emissions and composition and temporal modulation of the light emitted by the screens. And finally, at the end of this group of this work, a report was published in 2021. Which is available online in French. I'm sorry, but it has not been translated up to now. However, as I will say later, a short report which is about the opinion of the agency and the main results are available also in an English versions. Next slide. Yes, just to give an overview of the 12 member of the group with people from various domains: psychology, neurosciences, cognitive science, ergonomics, psychology, ophthalmology, otorhinolaryngologist, and computer science and virtual reality. Next slide. The process. Sorry. To continue on the process overview, we have a collective analysis of the international scientific literature with the following characteristics or criterions. We also considered, we only considered journals without prejudging their impact factor, and we excluded narrative review, but included meta-analysis. The journals was, the period considered was from January 2010 to January 2020. We only reviewed English and French papers. And we did our query on two databases, Scopus and PubMed, by using a cross-reference between a theorist with health effects and a theorist associated with the technologies. So we collected 1,048 papers. And on this basis, all the group reviewed the content in a first step based on the abstract, and then on the content, the full content of the papers. We assessed the methodological quality of the papers and the level of evidence regarding the various health effects. We added a posteriori some case studies that were published after January 2022, and also some papers prior to 2010 for some effect introductions. Next slide. The working group investigated 8 potential adverse effects by discussing and looking at the literature in the first steps. And these effects were the physical ergonomics of virtual reality and augmented reality interfaces, like musculoskeletal disorders, accidents, effect due to the aging of the interface and to noise levels, cyber sickness, potential neurological effects, like, for example, epileptic seizures, psychological and psychosocial effects, for example, emotional risk, deradicalization, effects related to the content, for example, dependency or addictions, content-related effects like violence, relationship to sexualities, social isolation, and etc. We looked also at developmental effects in various domains of the development, for example, cognitive development, emotional development, visual development, impaired sensory motor coordination caused by exposure, and also effects that could alter the self-image due to the fact that people could be displayed as avatars in the virtual worlds, and effects also related to physical agents like blue light, time modulation, and electromagnetic fields. Next slide. It's not the good slide. Yeah. Okay. So after presenting the methods, some results from these works. A first important result was about the assessment of the French people exposure to virtual reality and augmented reality systems and the impact on health. At the time we started the working group, there were few, if no reliable data regarding the exposure in the real life. We had a lot of data coming from the lab, but not from the real world. So we conducted or we commissioned a survey that has been carried by Opinionway in 2019. And I give you some of the results. At this time, at least 1/4 of French people and the children of 1 in 3 French people had been exposed to VR on air, with an increasing exposure in the recent years. The profile of users for adults was people rather young, average age of 40, male with socioeconomic category high, living in large city with children and with a good command of new technology. And for the profile of child users was young from 6 years old to later, with two main group most represented that were children between 9 and 11 and 14 and 13 years old, and more boys than girls, 55% of boys. Regarding the type of use of VR and AR, it was mainly virtual reality and video games for private use, and especially among children. For adults, the type of device was mostly smartphone, whereas it was game consoles among children. Regarding professional uses, virtual reality was represented in a similar fashion than augmented reality, and the type of application were mainly related to training, health, or stock management, and they mostly use computers and headsets. We had done data also regarding the duration of a session of use, and it was on average more than an hour for almost all uses, and the median duration observed of 1 hour for a session for both adults and children. Next slide. We also found that about 30% of adults and children report having experienced symptoms either during or after the exposure to virtual reality, in particular with headset. I don't want to list all the data, but if we have a look on the children, which is the last column, we can show that they suffer mostly when 90% of children suffered from visual fatigue, headache, and also dizziness, which was the three most frequent symptoms, and it increased until 35% for adults that have both that have both a professional and private use of virtual reality and augmented reality, with headache, nausea, and visual fatigue are the most represented, most frequent symptom that were reported. So it is quite, it was quite a surprise for us to see such an amount of spontaneous reported symptoms. Next slide. Regarding the measure and the literature review, we found some effects that were sufficiently documented in the literature. The first one, and which is the major part of the literature today on the health effects of VR, and is cyber sickness, and I will let Stanney to talk about these topics in the next talk. The second effect, which is also documented, also there are very few research on that, is about the changes in sensory, motor, and perceptual abilities after exposures, which are effects we are due to the existence of sensory incongruence during exposure, and this incongruence had an effect after being exposed to the virtual reality. And we found in the literature some results which demonstrated a reduction in pointing accuracy, some changes in the length and frequency of walking steps once being back in the real environment, and also a major underestimation of body rotation. So this aspect is quite sorry. This aspect has very few research at the moment, and it's a very important point, especially for us when we use a driving simulator in our university. And we have to take this aspect into account when we have a participant to our experiments that should take their car back after being immersed in the driving simulation. We found also effects associated with physical agents, in particular blue light, since it has been measured by the CFTB, on our headset and smartphone we use in the measure, which have a role in the occurrence of AMD and also which have an effect on circadian rhythms and sleep. We also we were also very surprised by the results of measure regarding the temporal light modulation, since our colleague found rates around 100% in a frequency range from 70 to 90 Hertz, and which is well known in the literature. And I give you here the reference from a previous ANSES report, that it is triggering epileptic seizure in the range of 1 to 80 Hertz, and it has a possible effect on visual fatigue, headaches, and migraine attacks in the range of 50 to 120 Hertz. Next slide. Effects. Well, we have also some some of effects which are not for which we cannot conclude due to the fact that there are no or two less studies available. The first one is about ergonomics related effects. That is, for example, musculoskeletal disorders, occurrence of accidents, etc. For example, regarding accidents, there are no studies on virtual reality or anecdotal reports, and very few studies on augmented reality with a focus on mobile augmented reality in particular, with a list of studies on Pokemon Go. Regarding psychological and psychosocial effects, there are too few studies and they are very difficult to synthesize due to difficulty in the methodology, which are very different and with some limits. This is the same for the effect on self-image in the virtual world. No study we found. We did not find study about neurological effects, and also we see that no longitudinal studies have been done up to now regarding the effect on development. Next slide. Sorry. The final result is related to the identification of population groups which are much more susceptible to have adverse health effects, with two main population or two main family of population. First, population which are in principle susceptible to cyber sickness due to the physiological state and the condition which are associated with the immersion in virtual or augmented reality. In particular, related to the difficulties that arise with multisensory integration in incongruent virtual environments. And these are, for example, pregnant women, people with vestibular disorders, people which are prone to motion sickness, people which suffer from static postural or dynamic balance anomalies with proprioception disorders, people susceptible to accumulator disorders such as strabismus, insufficient convergence, etc. People which are migraine sufferers, and people with an anxious temperament or suffer from panic attacks. The second group is related to the light radiation emitted by devices for which some populations are more susceptible due to their age or the state of their health. In particular, children, adolescents, and young adults, because they are a very clear and transparent lens. People which are aphakic, they are nullants or pseudo-phakic individuals. People which suffer from eye disease or anomalies, and people which are suffering from sleep disorders or which are suffering from photosensitive epilepsy. And next slide. And this work, as it has been done in a government agency, which aim to provide elements for the regulation and for the public politics. So we did some recommendation. I did not give them here in details, and you can find in the at the address the content in English of all the recommendations, so you can take it. Globally, there are three main recommendations orientation. The first one is to inform users about the proven health effects, but also about health effects for which no conclusion were not drawn at this step, and to regulate, and also a recommendation which are about the regulation or the supervision of uses in order to protect people by limiting the occurrence of adverse effects when immersed in virtual reality or when using augmented reality devices. And the third orientation is about research and studies. So it means that here, in the context of the conference, I will give some more information. Mainly, when we reviewed the literature, we had a lot of problem regarding the reproducibility of studies and the description of the devices and of the study condition in the scientific publication. So it means that this should be improved in the future to make easy the elaboration of synthesis on health effects. Some aspect, as it has been said just before, should be investigated, since there are at the moment no or very few studies. For example, regarding the psychological and psychosocial risk, the effect of exposures on children's development, potential neurological effects, or problematic use and addictions, etc. We need to have a better understanding of the effect of embodiment when using avatars to interact in virtual reality. We aim to have a better documentation regarding the effect caused by exposure or occurring after exposure to virtual reality, and to identify more precisely on the technical factors and the individual factors which are involved in the occurrence of these different effects. We have to clarify also the effect. Thanks, Alexis. The effects of related to ergonomics, accident, risk of falling, etc., and to analyze also the currently available content of virtual reality device to the general public in order to assess, in particular, the incongruence which is experienced by people and the possible effects which could occur after exposure. We should also continue to investigate cyber sickness determinant and mechanism, obviously. And also, it could be interesting to investigate the effects of co-exposure to virtual or augmented reality with other risk factors such as tobacco, psychotropic substances, alcohol, etc. In particular, relatively to the use of these devices in a vocational situation. We should also investigate the long-term consequences of repeated exposure, in particular, the fact that it could potentially aggravate the pre-existing condition. We should also obtain a better characterization of current exposition of population and the type of uses which are developed in the general population, and there are also some ethical aspects that could be addressed, and that have been addressed, in fact, in the report. So, in conclusion, addressing these research gaps would be critical in the future, in particular in the current context of all the efforts which are done at the moment to develop business and technology related to what is called in the media by metaverses. Next slide. Thank you for your attention, and I give you the address to upload both the English version of the opinions report and the complete report with the opinion and the account of the working group work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. I don't know if we can't really applaud you on Teams right now, but I see people in the physical room doing it. So thank you very much. So do we have questions? We have time for 1 or 2 questions, maybe on Teams or in the physical room. If you have questions in Teams, you can raise your hand. Oh, I have one.
Alex, if you can stop the slide so I can see
I can do that.
The participant of the meeting. Thank you.
I see 2 questions, one by Indira and one by Nicolas in Teams. I will read the question from Nicolas in Teams. Was the scope of this report only headsets, so stereo or mono, both?
Mostly headset, either headset or the use of smartphone that can be used also in some headsets. This is mostly, and we did not address stereo for the reason that the previous report in 1999 was about stereo. So we concentrated on headset and the other aspect of F impact than stereo.
And Indira, you had a question. I don't know if the mic is working in the physical room though. I think we can hear it. Oh, no, we can hear it. Yeah, so maybe if you can.
Can you hear me?
Can hear you, yeah.
I hear you, Indira.
Okay. I have a question for everybody, which is about this study existing now in France, but are there some initiatives in Europe or maybe in other countries? Alexis, now you are in the States, and maybe you have heard about that.
I'm not sure. I don't know if, Jean-Marie, you heard about any initiatives in Europe or...
I don't know at the moment. Just I can tell that 1 year ago, when I was still at ANSES. The people from ANSES ask the question to their colleague in Europe and also in United States, and the different correspondents they have in government agencies similar to ANSES. And they had responses that all were very interested by the topics, but had not at this time make a similar work. It was 1 year ago, so maybe it has changed a bit.
It's exactly why I'm doing this workshop right now and inviting people from the States, for instance, because we will talk about it later on during the roundtable, what we can do together, or what is done in other countries, for instance. That will be interesting as well. Well, thank you again, Jean-Marie. We will go straight away with Kay Stanney. I don't know, Kay, if you already have your slides on, or I can give you actually the...
Yeah, if you can let me share, I have my slides up and ready to go.
I don't know if we can let the Kay control our slides or not, because I can right now, but I don't know if you can give it to the control to Kay as well. Yeah. So in the meantime, I will try to introduce you. Once again, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Kay Stanney. She's the CEO and founder of Design Interactive in Orlando, Florida. Before that, she has been professor at the University of Central Florida. And for the past 30 years, if I'm not mistaken, she has written some of the most influential works on VR side effects and especially cyber sickness. And she has contributed massively to the ergonomics of immersive technologies. She held and kept holding several positions in associations in the US about immersive technologies and ergonomics. All those activities got her to receive several awards from the IEEE community and also from the corporate community. So, Kay, the floor is yours if everything is working for you.
Can you see my slides?
I do see your slides, and I think everyone does.
Okay, super. Well, thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts today. I truly appreciate that. And today what I'm going to do is focus on our work, which is done, the main objective is to look at the physiological impact of what everyone's calling the metaverse, both from a qualitative and a quantitative perspective, and to derive principles and lessons learned from those activities. And so that's what I'll be going over today. The first thing I want to talk about is what is the metaverse? And I want to talk about that because I keep seeing a question pop up, which is what's the difference between the metaverse and extended reality? And so because we've heard that question so much, we decided to actually try to differentiate the two. And so this is adapted from work by John Radoff in Building the Metaverse, where he has characterized the metaverse as having several different layers. These do not match one for what he did, because within his characterization of these layers, there still was no clear differentiation between extended reality and the metaverse. And so that's what we've done in this work. And if you look at the center of this diagram here with these multiple layers, what we've done in the darker area here is to differentiate what extended reality is. And if you take a look at the right-hand side, the components that you need to get to the point where you have an extended reality are the infrastructure, the enabling technologies, the human interfaces. You put all of those together, and then you can have your extended reality experiences. And in the enterprise or in the workplace, what we use that for is digital enablement. So I can have a job performance aid, or I can have immersive training. If I have immersive training, I want to get them into a flow state so I get better training. So those are the kind of activities that are within what we see as the realm or the hub of extended reality. And then if we extend beyond that into the green areas, the main objective that we see for the metaverse is not just digital enablement, but the use of data as a strategic asset. And we see this as really the ring of power, where we have all these different data assets that we can accumulate from the individual who is experiencing something, for example, a training experience. We can gather data from them, from their movements, from their physiology. If we're in the workplace, we can couple those with digital twins and the digital phenotype of the human themselves. And all of a sudden, we can start to optimize everything, the way the system works, the way the human works, and get a lot out of the data that's in real time being collected. And of course, that information then can be spatialized, and within the metaverse, one of the big components that people talk about is the creator economy. And I definitely want to be considering that also within the workplace, because we think it would be really intriguing to see if you put these tools in the hands of the workers and provide automatic content generation tools, and also encourage them to use those tools by compensating them, the kind of benefits you could get by solving problems at the point of need. We think that is a very intriguing concept. And then you pull all these together into digital spaces, whether they be for the enterprise or gaming or sports or theater and beyond. And so today, when we're talking here about the XR core, and this is, hang on, okay, and this is where we're talking about the physiological impact. So we're talking about the impact, with the content that we create and the user experience that we create it with the devices that we see it with, and the way that we immerse you in the content that we immerse you in. So that's really where our work is focusing today in this presentation. So what is the physiological impact? We basically can have an adverse impact to our physiology, as Jean-Marie was saying. We have all the different cyber sickness subjectively reported symptoms, and those occur because of things like diminished sensory cues. We have depth, size, and scene distortions, reduced illumination, lack of vestibular cues, a form factor issues like a small field of view, and of course the really nettlesome vergence versus accommodation conflicts, and optic limitations such as a single depth plane, or how big is that eye box exactly within which I can see different content. Our content design is so important. And so, the headset may be limited, but if we do the content right, we can overcome those limitations. And the content design, we look at, how provocative are the conflicts, how much in control is the user, and can they, if they're not in control, can they anticipate the direction of movement? Yet all of these things can go wrong. And for some people, they feel nothing. And for other people, they feel a whole lot. And the individual differences vary a great deal because they vary along 3 dimensions. How sensitive are you as an individual? How readily do you adapt as an individual? And once you have been experiencing adverse effects, how quickly do those dissipate within you? And so we, in the literature, suggest that the individual differences can actually vary from 10,000 to 1. So we're dealing with, this isn't the same for everybody. So finding a solution is going to be difficult. We took a really deep dive into individual differences. Lockheed Martin asked us to do this. And in particular, what they wanted to do is they wanted to determine why females typically have a more of an adverse effect than males. And when I started this work, we gathered 14 different variables, and I was sure I'd done a lot of individual difference research, and I was sure we would find variables related to the XX chromosome that were driving these differences, such as our hormonal levels or our spatial ability, so we couldn't orient appropriately on average. Or our anxiety levels, which on average are high. I thought there would be something related to the XX chromosome. And what was really interesting after looking deeply at these 14 variables is we actually found that it was the headset design, and particularly the IPD range. And this is by far my most cited, most viewed article ever. And a lot of people are interested in this. I like the interest in it because, to me, if we don't fix this, it's going to be an accessibility limitation. And while that didn't matter, I mean, Jean-Marie showed that mostly right now, VR users are gamers and they're male. And so from an economics perspective, the headset manufacturers took the average interpupillary distance of the male at 63, 64 millimeters and built the headset around those. those. And that was fine from an economic perspective. But now if VR is being used in the enterprise for training, that's not acceptable any longer, because we can't have accessibility limitations where people who can fit into the headset can advance in their careers because they can get the VR training, and those who can't, who will primarily be females, can't advance because they can't get the training. One of the most intriguing things was we did a follow-up study for Lockheed, where we matched the IPD to the headset. So we had females that matched and didn't match, and we had males that matched and didn't match, and the sex differences disappeared. They weren't there any longer. The other thing that happens and why females may experience greater sickness when they don't fit is females on average tend to have a smaller IPD than males. And so what does this mean? Well, when we converge on an object to bring it into focus, our eyes, of course, turn in, and we accommodate at the image and we bring it into focus. We don't spend our days diverging our eyes. Well, in the headsets, when the women's IPD is smaller than the range accommodated by the headset, what we're forcing them to do is diverge their eyes. And imagine, I guess the only thing I can really liken it to is if you wore someone else's spectacles all day long and how you would feel. So this is a very big visual strain on females whose IPD is smaller than the headset. And we had a really hard time, by the way, in this study, finding males that didn't fit the headset. Finding females was easy, but finding males was not a problem at all. So basically what we want to do is push manufacturers to really, really widen up that IPD adjustable range. And if they widened it from 50 to 77 millimeters, we would accommodate pretty much everyone on the planet. So the technology has to be right, is the bottom line and the moral to this story. And right now, there's not a lot of people focused at this level to get it right from the manufacturing perspective, because it costs money. So what do we experience when we're dealing with cyber sickness? Well, the important thing is to realize it's just not during the experience, but it's after the experience as well. And so during the experience, we definitely deal with a lot of headaches and eye strain, and we deal with a lot of sweating and dizziness. Once we start to get to burping, then we're going to end up with nausea and vomiting. And we do, regularly in XR systems see these symptoms, as Jean-Marie shared. And then afterwards, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with similar things to when people have had too much alcohol, where their hand-eye coordination is disturbed, their visual functioning is disturbed, and their postural stability is disturbed. And these are the kinds of things we deal with after exposure. Is this real? I encourage any one of you to go on a blog today, a Twitter, and put in a virtual reality and sickness. And what you're going to see is it's really real. People who are using these headsets are experiencing these kind of ill effects every single day. And so, I keep the one, most of these are from this month or last month, or well, we're in November now, sorry. But October and September, but I like to keep the one from 2016 up there, because this is the after effects we're dealing with. And that is, interesting phenomena, more VR that I play, the less sick I get in VR, but apparently I start getting sick from motion in the real world, those after effects. And those to us are a safety concern. And I'll tell you more in a bit why we feel they are a safety concern. But overall, the awareness is out there. As you see, cyber sickness could spell an early death for the metaverse. Definitely people are aware of these limitations. And so it's something that needs a great deal of attention to resolve. From a theoretical perspective, we don't have any definitive theories, but we do have a number of hypotheses. The sensory conflict theory is probably the most popular. And this is, basically what we see in these environments typically is virtual motion, but what we feel when we're sitting in our chair from our vestibular system is that we're sitting still. And so that the visual vestibular conflict leads to, our brain saying what's going on, and this is often sickness inducing. And what's interesting is if you think about that, then augmented reality is different, because with augmented reality, I'll back up a minute. With the virtual reality headsets, in the beginning, when they came back onto the market, I did work with the manufacturers and really begged them to leave the periphery open. And they said, absolutely will not do that. You're going to lose presence. You're going to lose immersion. We need the periphery closed. And if you close up that periphery, we have no rest frames in the real world. And so this visual vestibular conflict is very potent. And but with AR, because you can see the real world all the time, you consistently have real world rest frames that you can calibrate your vestibular system against. And so you're seeing differences in the level of sickness between VR and AR because of those rest frames, we believe. The ecological theory, which Stoffregen is a big proponent of, is the fact that in these environments, we tend to have altered specificity. You'll have a visual acceleration without a related control of your body, or you'll have a rotation without your body rotating. And this tends to lead to postural instability. And the more postural instability you have, the more motion sickness develops. We have the poison theory, which is just basically a fundamentally evolutionary theory, which says when our sensory systems are all discombobulated, that's the same thing that happens when we're sick. And when we're sick, we want to get rid of the toxins that are causing us to be sick. And so we vomit, and that emetic response is meant to, just dispel what's causing our sensory systems to be disturbed. Well, extended reality disturbs our sensory systems in a very similar way. And so our body actually thinks that we're being poisoned. And so it triggers that emetic response to rid the body of the poison. And then our rest frame hypothesis, which I spoke of a little bit ago when we compared VR to AR, but basically that conflict between the visual and the vestibular, can we find a way to have an anchor to tell our systems we are not moving? And if we have that anchor or rest frame, then we can basically weight that stationary cue more and not the visual motion, the vection, the illusory sense of motion. If we have a consistently available rest frame, we can try to reduce the sickness because we're reducing the potency of the conflict between the visual and the vestibular systems. All right, so what have we discovered to date? So we've done, we've run thousands of people, I think, by now, and looked at VR and AR sickness rates. And one of the things that we're really focused on is accessibility. Can people use these technologies in the metaverse and beyond on the jobs and use them effectively, or are they not going to be able to withstand exposure? And in VR, we find over large numbers of people that the dropout rate tends to be about 13%. The longer the exposure, the higher the dropout rate. And very consistently, we find with VR an emetic response rate of 1%. So we have 1% vomiters very consistently, which is great that it's only 1%. And when I work with the amusement parks, that's usually what they're bringing me in to do, is reduce the cleanup of the vomit. And we do that through content design. So we change the content, we can reduce the emetic response rate. So it is controllable. So because of these dropout rates, we see VR is physiologically self-limiting because those who are susceptible will tend to drop out, which this then poses the accessibility limitations. As I mentioned earlier, we feel those accessibility limitations are related to the system engineering choices. So things like your interpupillary distance, adjustable range, and your content design choices. And then the other thing that is very prevalent and long-lasting in VR are the physiological after effects. We'll talk more about those in a bit, and that we feel poses a safety concern once people exit the exposure. A lot of people ask me, is it better with the new headsets? The answer is no. In fact, some of the headsets are worse. The worst levels of dropouts and needing to drive subjects home that I've experienced is with a headset that's on the market today. So the new headsets are not better. And so, getting the optics better, getting the update rates better has not reduced the rates. On the augmented reality side, I at first thought we had good news, and then a couple different things happened that made me aware that it's really how you use augmented reality that's going to indicate how adverse the physiological impact is. So we did a large-scale operational AR study. What does that mean? We used augmented reality as a source of training for casualty care. So the individual put the headset on, approached a mannequin, applied care such as opening an airway or applying a tourniquet, And during this operational use, we had no dropouts whatsoever. We had no emetic response rates whatsoever. And so with the current generation of AR headsets, such as the HoloLens or Magic Leap, or the tablet, we also did a projection tablet. We did not find AR to be physiologically self-limiting because there were no dropouts whatsoever. However, there was an impact to hand-eye coordination that I'll talk to you in a bit about, which poses safety concerns. Now, back up, it doesn't mean AR is okay, because if you use it in a provocative way, what does that mean? You can do virtual reality in the augmented reality headset. You can drive a lot of vection in the headset, and then you'll get rates very similar to VR. Also, the US Army has developed a system where they've coupled the AR headset with night vision systems, and this is leading to very high levels of cyber sickness in a manner similar to what we see with VR. So, and for them in particular, they're coupling it with image intensification, I2 systems, and thermal imaging systems. And so when I couple the AR headset with these other types of visual, optical effects, then I am exacerbating the adverse effects. So we can use AR in a way that it's not limited from an accessibility perspective, but there are still definitely safety concerns. And we can use it in a way where it's just like VR and it has the accessibility and the safety concerns. Can you pour enough money in and fix this? If you focus on it, maybe, the IVAS program within the Army here is a $20 billion program. They did not focus on the human factors issues. And so just recently, this came out where the Army needs to improve the human factors of these headsets or they're not going to be adopted. And so we have to get this right. And if we don't, it's going to prohibit its use. So now I'm going to get into some of our data and what we know, from a qualitative and a quantitative perspective. When I report the qualitative results, I'm using the Simulator Sickness Questionnaire, or the SSQ, and I'm looking at 3 clusters of symptoms: disorientation, which you'll see a D indicator; nausea, which you'll see an N indicator; and ocular motor, which you'll see an O indicator. So here we're looking at the severity of the symptoms using the total score of the SSQ. And what we're comparing is legacy, old VR headsets that, when I first was in this 30 years ago and the headsets were $40,000, current VR headsets where we fit the IPD, current headsets where we did not fit the IPD, and look how much worse they are than the legacy systems of 30 years ago. Operational AR, where we're using AR as those informational overlays. We're not driving a lot of vection. We are providing point of need operational support or training, and we're using it in an informational support way at the point of need. And then provocative AR, where we're using the AR headset in the same way as VR and creating a lot of vection. And so what you can basically see here is that the AR, if we use it as an information source at the point of need, we have very low levels of adverse effects. You also see if the IP does not fit in the current generation headsets, that women are much more adversely affected. You also see that the legacy systems and the current VR systems are about the same in their adverse effects. We don't have gains from the updated optics and update rates and all that good stuff. Really didn't have an impact. And then at the right-hand side, you see that we are driving a lot of adverse effects in AR if we're using it in a provocative way. And so another thing to point out here is the non-fit VR data there is that the impact is really affected by the design choices we make. And if we make poor design choices, then we're going to really drive up the adverse effects. And so the other thing to say that's not representative here, but we're going to provide some more data, is in VR, typically you have the most disorientation. So if we go backwards, you're going to have that difficulty concentrating, dizziness, fullness of the head, vertigo. And then the next with VR, the next is the nausea cluster with your increased salivation, burping, stomach awareness, sweating, and the least amount of ocular motor with your blurred vision, eye strain, eye fatigue, and headaches. And then if we look at AR in an operational AR perspective, you're driving mostly ocular motor issues, then some disorientation, and a very little bit of nausea. And I have some EGG data that I'll show you in that respect. And if you're using AR in a provocative way, then your profile is very similar to your VR profile with mostly disorientation, but in this case, ocular motor. So the AR systems are hard on the ocular motor system, even when it's used provocatively, and the least amount of nausea. We found this incredibly interesting. Now, on the left-hand side, you have a cross-section of the symptoms from VR, and on the right hand, you have it from operational AR, so those informational overlays. And what's really intriguing here is that you see that the adverse effects that people are experiencing and subjectively reporting are primarily the ocular motor symptoms. Look how few symptoms you have on the right-hand side versus the left. With VR, you're kind of experiencing the whole gamut of symptoms. With AR, you're doing eye strain, difficulty focusing, and you're really in visual fatigue. You're really loaded on the ocular motor with very little of disorientation or nausea. If you look at the symptom severity here, you'll see that on the left-hand side with VR that there's a whole lot more people that are in the extreme range. What we've done with the SSQ is bucket it into, are you having low symptoms, less than 15.5 total score on the SSQ, a moderate level, 15.5 to 20, a medium level, high, and extreme level. And when you're at the extreme level, you definitely have everybody dropping out, and you have an increased propensity towards emetic responses. And so a whole lot more people in the extreme range in VR, and in operational AR, a much smaller number at the extreme level, and mostly people at the low level. In terms of age differences, you do have age differences in both VR and AR, but it's interesting because it affects people differently. So with VR, 18 to 30-year-olds tend to experience the worst effects, and primarily disorientation. And for AR, females in the 50 to 65-year range had the worst impact to them physiologically, and again, mostly in the disorientation range, which is different than the average overall. If we look at exposure duration, this was completely mind-blowing to us. When we did our first large-scale AR study with operational content, we thought we would be one and done. What does that mean? We thought we'd be able to use all the principles that we'd gathered from VR and apply it to AR, and we thought AR would just be the benign counterpart to VR. It's not at all what we found. What we found is an inverse relationship. With VR, what we have here at the bottom, this 14 to 20, 40 to 45, and 60 to 120, that's minutes of exposure. And with VR, as the minutes of exposure increase, the adverse effects increase. I'm sorry, that was VR. Did I say VR? I hope so. With AR, we found that as the exposure duration increased, the adverse symptoms reported decreased. We never saw that coming. And so there is a gap right now in terms of understanding what's the appropriate exposure duration in AR, particularly to drive what we call dual adaptation, which means I can seamlessly go from the real world to the AR world and back to the real world without those long-term adverse physiological after effects that compromise things like my visual functioning, my hand-eye coordination, and my postural stability. And that is a gap right now that we have not filled. And then if you look at the right-hand side, using AR in a similar manner to VR with provocative content that drives affection, you've got really high levels. All right, our sex differences. There was another surprising outcome here. So on the left-hand side, what we have is in a VR experience where the IPD fit, and then the next one is where the IPD did not fit, and then our AR operational 120-minute exposure, and our AR operational 20-minute exposure. And what you see here is the green is immediately after exposure, and then the blue is for the males. The blue is immediately after exposure for females, and then the yellow is 1 hour post-exposure males, and the dark green is 1 hour post-exposure females. And what you're seeing from the first and the second VR IPD fit to non-fit is a whole lot more of an effect on the female, and the after effects lasting a long time with those females. With the AR, look at the difference between the 120 and the 20-minute. You have worse symptoms with the 20-minute exposure. And then very surprisingly, look at the yellow. We had worse effects from males on average than females in AR operational short duration exposures, which was very interesting. And it's a good sample size here. We also do objective assessments. So whereas all that subjective data was based on our SSQ and our self-reporting of nausea, disorientation, and oculomotor symptoms, we also take people before and immediately after exposure and out to 1 or 2 hours post-exposure at 15-minute increments, measuring their hand-eye coordination with a pass-pointing type measure, measuring their visual functioning with a VOR type measure, and measuring their postural stability. And so we're taking and really looking at their functioning after exposure versus before exposure. If we look at VR, sorry, I don't have any way to hang that up. If you look at our VR exposure here, this is a 2-hour exposure. And what you're seeing here on the left-hand side is time post-exposure on the y-axis. And you see that the visual after effects, the VOR gain, shifts in VOR gain, it took about an hour to regain pre-exposure baseline performance. And with our hand-eye coordination measures and our postural stability measures, 2 hours post-exposure never recovered to baseline levels. If we look at AR, and this is again a 2-hour exposure, and we're comparing it to baseline, our visual VOR measure regained baseline levels in about 45 minutes, and our postural stability regained in about 15 minutes, but our hand-eye coordination never recovered to baseline levels. And this was one that really brought safety concerns to us because post-exposure, what we found with AR 2-hour exposures was that your hand-eye coordination was better with your eyes closed than with your eyes open. So your visual system was really compromised. Your proprioception and vestibular systems were still on point, but your visual systems were really off 2 hours of post-exposure. And so, or 1 hour, I'm sorry, post-exposure. And so we really feel that this leads to safety concerns, and we have to make sure that, we understand how compromised people are. And this hand-eye coordination disturbance was not like VR where people aren't feeling well, so they know they're compromised. People were feeling fine. They had low nausea symptomatology, and their EGG was fine. And so even from a physiological perspective, they weren't compromised from a nausea dimension, just from a visual dimension, and they wouldn't be aware of it because they would be feeling fine. We took a look at the EGG, the gut activity, and in particular, what you're showing here is tachygastria, which is a faster than normal stomach contraction because you're going to get that stuff out of your stomach, so your contractions start to increase beyond the normal power band, and you're trying to force emesis. Your normal EGG power band is in the 12 to 15% of the band. And with short duration VR exposure, tachygastria tends to increase to about 20 to 25. And we're going to use that as a basis of comparison for AR. And so, and that also is typically associated with high subjective reports of nausea. So I'm feeling nauseous and I'm reporting, and my body physiologically is experiencing nausea, and I'm subjectively feeling it and reporting it. So here we are comparing the Magic Leap to the HoloLens 1. And if we look at the Magic Leap, the 1 to 2 hour exposure, 1 2 hour exposure, or 6 20-minute exposures, our tachygastria power was comparable to rest, that 12 to 15% power band. And a 3 40-minute exposures, tachygastria power was comparable to short duration VR exposure. Over at the HoloLens, our 1 to 2 hour and 6 20-minute exposures showed tachygastria similar to short duration exposures, and our 3 40-minute was our tachygastria power was substantially higher than short duration VR exposures. So a couple things to point out. the main difference between our Magic, there's a lot of differences, but a big difference between our Magic Leap and our HoloLens one is the fact that the Magic Leap has multiple depth planes. And we've looked at this from performance perspectives, human performance perspectives, and a lot of different perspectives. And this is the first time that we've seen maybe that there's a bit of a benefit to the multiple depth planes, because we do see less of the tachygastria. And so, maybe if we're putting less of a visual load because our depth planes are more in line with natural vision, maybe that would reduce the adverse effects from the gut. And then what we're seeing from the HoloLens single depth plane form factor is that we have a lot of tachygastria at the 340-minute exposures. And so this 40-minute level of exposure may be a time where your body's transitioning in AR, because by this 1-2 hour exposure, you're just not feeling much of anything. And at the same time, notice that subjectively reported nausea was very low in AR. So your body's feeling it, but you're not subjectively feeling it. All right, lessons learned. Let's first look at usage protocols. We know what to do with VR. We've been doing it for 30 years. Can we fix the problem? No. Can we reduce the problem? Yes. So if we have a low to medium dose VR exposure, which we use the SSQ to kind of provide dose levels, and we've also equated VR provocative levels to your blood alcohol levels. So there's a couple different ways to say how potent is the stimuli. And if I have a low to medium dose exposure, my initial exposure could be 15 to 30 minutes with an intersession and recovery period of 2 to 3 days. But if I have a high dose, then I want to keep my exposures less than 10 minutes, and I want 2 to 5 day intersession recovery periods. We know we want that headset IPD to be opened up to adjustable range 50 to 75. And then a bunch of things about the way we should do VR exposure. We know, provide airflow, keep the temperatures low, set criteria for terminating. If you see a lot of sweating, get people out of there. If you see people holding their head really still and they don't feel like they can move, get them out of there. We have a lot of different ways to know, how to reduce the symptoms. And we also know, we also know to expect a 1% emetic response rate and to be ready for that. With regard to AR, we don't know is the real bottom line. We thought that the way we looked at exposure, the 1-2 hour exposure, the 340-minute exposures and the 620-minute exposures, we really thought the 620-minute exposures was going to be the answer, because with VR it would be, and that would be done and we'd know how to use it, and everything that applied to VR could be used for AR. It's not what we found. As I mentioned earlier, we found that inverse relationship. And so we really don't know how to appropriately use AR at this point. The only thing I can liken it to at this point is I think AR may be behaving like astigmatic lenses. I was able to find one study in the literature which looked at 2 4-hour exposures, and it looked at there were 2 4-hour exposures and there were 2 2-hour exposures in that study. And we had 1 2-hour exposure in our study. And what the astigmatic lens study showed is that that people did not get back to baseline with the 2 2-hour exposures, but they did for the 2 4-hour exposures. So when you get new glasses, what does your doctor say? He says, keep them on. You're going to get headaches. It's going to be uncomfortable, but keep them on and you'll adapt. That may be what's going on in AR, but we're not sure, and more research is needed. At this point, the only thing we can say is not to expect dropouts or emetic responses with operational AR. In terms of how we reduce cyber sickness, I'm going to just go through this really quickly because I think I must be running out of time by now. But we use things, we align our mitigations with the different hypotheses. So for our sensory conflict hypotheses, we try to reduce the sensory conflicts by using things like peripheral blur or a motion base that provides the missing vestibular cues, or dynamic field of view. And I'm not even going to do that. There's more ways we do it. From a postural stability perspective, we try to use visual leading indicators. So if you can see, if you can see, there's a blue line here, there's not a blue line here. And so here I can start to see where I'm going to be moving with those blue lines. And I actually can start moving my head in in synchronization with that movement and reduce the adverse effects. Over here on the right-hand side, we have a physical leading indicator, meaning that someone could put their hands on a steering wheel being controlled by someone else, but feel where they're moving, and that could help. Also, never ever take away viewpoint control, and this is probably one of the biggest ways to make people sick, is to not have them be able to update with where they view the scene updates. That's a really provocative issue, and so we always want to provide active viewpoint control. With regard to the evolutionary poison theory, what you're trying to do is drive adaptation, and there's different ways to do that. You can have a masked exposure where you just keep them in there, and with VR that does not work. With AR, it seems like it might. With habituation, you can look at how many times should I repeat the exposure for you, and what should be my intercession intervals. And you also, within both of them, can look at incremental exposures, which means starting with something very benign and then increasing the provocativeness of the content over time. And then lastly, with our multisensory re-rating hypothesis, we want to re-weight the conflicts. And one way we can do that is if we have missing vestibular cues, we can provide a rest frame either in the foreground or in the background, which the background's preferred, and that rest frame would be congruent with the missing vestibular cues that we're, because we're sitting still, and this can help to re-weight those missing cues. And all right, so I'm going to just jump to the R&D agenda. We originally provided an R&D agenda back in '98, and we updated this in 2020, and it's published in the International Journal of Human-Computer Interaction, and you can find the details there. But just some high-level things that we said in this, we definitely need the usage protocols. We feel we have them for VR, but we do not have them for AR. We've got to figure out what the right number of exposures, length of exposures, and the combination, so that we can drive adaptation and reduce those after effects that compromise safety. We really need to understand user susceptibility in both real time during the experience and after effects. And we feel we can do this by using the sensors of the headset, linking it back to that postural stability theory, and looking at how much head movement's going on to see how people are doing in real time. We really feel that research grade eye tracking in the XR devices is important for solving the cyber sickness question problem, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And yeah, I'll just move on. So, okay, on the left-hand side here, what is needed? Usage protocols for AR. We've got them for VR. We don't have them for AR. We need to quantify the physiological impact and figure out what is the right way to use these devices. Do I keep you in there for 4 hours so you adapt and then you can use the device safely from that point forward? I don't know, maybe. With VR, we know keep the exposure short, keep the content less provocative, use that incremental gain in provocativeness over time. With AR, we don't have an answer. The other thing we feel is so critical is to use the data from the headset, as well as that research grade eye tracking, as well as the biosignatures from smartwatches, to provide a real-time measure of the adverse effects and capturing that in real time so that you can use it to enhance safety. We feel this is possible because we already have a predictive algorithm that we use to predict cyber sickness that uses HRV, EDR, and the EGG, tachygastria, and bradygastria, and it's about 90% accurate. We want to get away from the sensors that are not on your watch because, the BioPac's great, but it's a lab based device. So we feel like we could get your heart rate variability from your watch, as well as the data from the headset, and create a real-time measure. And this is where we want to go to next. And also, as you see, the eye tracking would be in there. All right. So in conclusion, we feel XR is really poised to be the main interface for the metaverse, really the window into the metaverse, but feel that widespread adoption could be hindered by the adverse physiological impact, and in terms of both safety and because of the after effects, and accessibility because people drop out and can't stay in. VR, we really know what we're dealing with there. We've been studying it for 3 decades, and we've got it figured out. Definitely, it will pose safety and accessibility limitations that can be reduced if the hardware is designed appropriately and the content's designed appropriately. From an operational AR perspective, when we want to use this in the enterprise for information overlays at the point of need to support our workers, we do not feel that there will be any accessibility limitations with regard to dropouts and real real bad nausea type symptoms that make people not want to stay in. However, the compromised hand-eye coordination post-exposure, we do feel poses safety concerns. So we need to figure out the right protocols to drive adaptation, dual adaptation really, so I can seamlessly go back and forth. Also, we have to be aware that when AR is used in a provocative manner, similar to VR, or coupled with things like night vision systems, we're going to expect behavior similar to VR. And so there's really a need to get to the protocols that are going to drive safety in both VR and AR. And if we do that, we feel like we can increase both the accessibility and reduce the safety concerns with these technologies. We've got a whole lot of publications. And any questions?
Thank you, Kay. So yeah, if anyone has a question, okay, I saw a hand. Okay, I don't know if you can open up your mic or if you want to ask your question. Yeah, you can. It's a lot of echo. So Anita, if you want to, I don't know if you can open up your mic and ask your question, or otherwise you can try to write it down in the chat. But in the meantime, I might. Yeah, I do have a lot of questions, but we'll talk during the roundtable about all those things. But oh yeah, can hear you. Go ahead, Anita.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. With a lot of echo still, but. Sorry about that. So in the meantime, what I'm proposing is for Peter and Mo to join us right after Kay answering a few questions. Yeah, talk about everything we've seen during the talks and what we can do all together, or what we are planning to do at the French level in the States, or things like that, what we are doing currently and how we could join forces, basically.
Sure, happy to.
But I will ask you that question, Kay, in the meantime, because I don't see the sound getting better out there. Yeah, part of your work as a scientist and businesswoman is using AR and VR for training. But with all the limitations you presented, where do you think it's beneficial to use AR or VR right now, like with the current, tech?
So if we're talking in the enterprise, are we talking in the enterprise? Because of course they're going to use it for gaming forever. So I'm going to assume you're talking enterprise.
Yeah.
I definitely think VR is going to be limited. And so where should we use it? Definitely training. I'm not quite sure where else in the enterprise it would be appropriate, but it is an affecting trainer. We know that it's a very good consolidator. So I learn a lot of skills and then I go into the VR and I consolidate it. We also know it's really good when you're adding in the stressors of if you have a high tempo job, right? So if you have a high tempo stressful job, we can have scenarios that really ramp up the stressors, and we know that that's good. The issue to me is with the current headsets, that training will be accessible to those who are non-susceptibles, and that's really not appropriate. So that's a really nettlesome issue for me. If I can advance my job because I get this great training, but only if I'm not susceptible, we've got some serious issues there. So definitely I feel that's the place for it, training, and we need to overcome the issues. And definitely I think the IPD range could solve a lot of that if we could get manufacturers to do that, to really open up that range. From AR, we definitely see it both as a training and operational support tool. We are using it a lot already, especially with the trucking industry, for training and for troubleshooting. And of course, with the military, you know, we are developing, for example, right now, a combat casualty care trainer, where what I love about AR is the fact that lots of echoes.
Oh yeah, maybe Anita, can you turn off your mic? Thank you.
Yeah. What I like about AR is the embodiment aspect. You know, with VR, I really don't like all the haptic devices and all that if I'm training anything that's psychomotor, because with that intermediary device, you're not training in a way that I embody the actual realistic skills. And so I have a real issue with that. I think it can lead to negative and, you know, training. But with regard to, for example, what we're doing with casualty care, it's a very physical task. I have to apply tourniquets. I have to open up airways. I'm using my body. Well, with AR, I can use my body during the AR training, just like I would in the real world. I can approach either a human on the floor or a mannequin, and I can physically put the tourniquet on the mannequin or on the human. And the AR is just walking me through and providing support at the point of need. And it's telling me what to do and how to do it. And if we couple that with computer vision, which I hope we do, we can even capture what I'm doing in real time and say, no, you're not doing it right. You know, you didn't put that high and tight. You didn't turn that tourniquet tight enough. You need to do it, you know, more effectively. So operational support, point of need support, and point of need training, I think AR is phenomenal for. And if I'm not going to get, we have been coupling VR with our AR in terms of upping the stressors. For example, with our casualty care, we'll have a surround battlefield in the AR headset that's very similar to VR. And that way you can up the stresses as well. So I think AR training can do a lot of the same things VR training can do, but better when it's psychomotor skills, my opinion.
Okay, that's interesting to know. Yeah, so we will open up the roundtable with, I'll introduce first Maud Clavier, who joined us. She's one of the executives of the company VR Room, so more into the cultural aspects of VR, but also the president of the CNXR, which is I will call the French guild of XR, basically. And second, I will introduce Professor Peter Hancock from the University of Central Florida. So I will try to summarize his career in one sentence. Probably one of the most prolific scholars contributing to interactive technologies and psychology and cognitive ergonomics. So what we are going to try to do all together, and people in the audience are welcome to contribute as well, is, yeah, wadding up everything and trying to see what we can do, like joining force for some kind of a global roadmap. So I heard about Jean-Marie, who was talking about the studies, longitudinal studies we don't have yet, all the engineering aspects that are not considered by manufacturers. How can we make them listen, for instance, for the IPD? So maybe I will start with you, Maud, because you are talking about that with a lot of people in the industry. So I don't know what you heard about all those aspects.
Sorry.
Yeah, your mic.
If you mean sustainability for the industry in general, so what I told you, what I'm going to talk about again, is that today there is a lot of things we don't know, we can't calculate, we're unsure. So before having big dialogues or saying obvious things like it's less expensive for the footprint to do a virtual reality concert rather than going there live with the plane and to be hosted somewhere. We can't say that because we don't have the numbers. We are unsure. It depends on many levels. It depends on which type of events, where, how. So sorry.
Is for the ecology part, but for the more sanitary part, so for the side effects of VR, for you know, everything that can go wrong, for, like, for instance, nausea or oculomotor.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, on that side, for the bad effects, it's also complex to tell 100% because it depends a lot on the content. Of course, there is some data we can already calculate, but the content is going further and further. We are in the entertainment field pushing all the boundaries. So, and doing things for shorter time. So in our opinion, we try our best to create content that are more not causing disaster to the people who are watching it. We take a lot the feedbacks, but I saw a jump already when I used to be a 360 film director rather than a virtual reality concert creator. In the 360 film, it was very hard because you're static watching a 360 environment, so it makes you super dizzy. But being involved in the environment when it's well done is quite okay, but it depends a lot on the content creation. So I feel like now we are talking about the technology themselves without taking into account too much what type of content and how we can create content that are okay with the technology. So that's what we can talk about for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know if Pierre, you have insights on, previously how have we been dealing with those ergonomic limits, basically, with that immersive technologies and what we could.
Sure. Let me just make a few remarks, especially about the idea of international cooperation. So, the first thing I would say is that ergonomics, written widely, is the crux of acceptance of these technologies. And so, let me just observe that arguably the largest single commercial organization in the world in terms of gross resources, numbers, money, however you want to say it, has just rolled the dice in Vegas that they are now going to pivot that particular organization to something called the Metaverse, which absolutely requires these technologies and requires facile technologies. So we're talking certainly not well beyond the billions. We're talking about trillions of dollars in general that are being bet on this. And this is the crux of the acceptance, whether people will or won't accept it or not. So the number one recommendation I have to you, Alexis, is get those people to pay for the knowledge that you have in this particular room and get them to fly people out to California and have this sort of conversation right in front of them and their engineers. I don't think these are stupid people. So I'm going to say that one of the things we should do is to look for that sort of high level of support. What to a company like that is $5 million for an advanced conference? Nothing, absolutely nothing compared to the exposure that they have. So find the right person, and I think that's the first step. And then in reality, sort of space doesn't matter. The next thing I would observe is that the innovation happens and continues to happen regardless of human factors inputs. I mean, I was very impressed by Kay's interpeople distance, but I then look at what's coming out and I don't see the flexibility. I don't see anybody really taking much notice of that. And the reason they don't is that largely we publish in scientific journals. And I have an aphorism that if you really want to bury something, put it in a scientific journal. So I don't think it's ever seen again, but certainly not by commercial people. I do think there's a solution or a partial solution, and I would think it lies in the area of something called individuation. Individuation now takes the idea that everything is produced or mass produced. So it goes from the late-ish 18th century, early 19th century, when all tools were created largely for their user, their individual user, and we went to mass production, and now we're going back to individuation again. So as both of our speakers have pointed out, you can titrate these particular issues to the individual. So I think the the distance between the eyes is one, but both Kay and Jean-Marie gave us a variety of factors that you can begin to titrate for the individual. And so those are the flexibilities that need to be engendered in design, in ab initio design. I think we can certainly do that. Again, the question is why are they not knocking down everybody's door? But I mean, that's everybody's door. There's a last point I want to bring up before. So I'm sure you guys go back and remember Erwin Rock. Do you remember Rock and the inversion glasses? So Rock had a very interesting sort of experiment where he made people wear glasses that inverted the display, and they wore them for about a week. And sometime during that week, the the scene inverted back again. The brain did the adaptation that we're all aware of. And lo and behold, it was an interesting discovery, 1950s, I think. But I've heard some accounts later on that some of the people who had done Rock's experiment, especially during times of stress, had the world invert on them again suddenly. Now, I don't know the data on that, but if you create an adaptive system that then adapts to different circumstances, there's certainly a reasonable, rational basis to suggest that occasionally those frames of reference will get mixed up again. And I don't think Kay's data in particular suggests that we sort of turn the world 180 degrees over the top, but I think it does suggest that you get these, I won't call them confusions, but sort of oscillations of adaptation. I found very interesting indeed. And so I think that's very interesting because obviously the ramifications of this work is that we will end up potentially with people who have access to the metaverse and don't have access to the metaverse. And we've already seen what a divisive circumstance can be created when some people have access to technology and others don't. So that concerns me. But my last observation, and it's only a quick one because it's a philosophical one and we are battling the near-term problems, but it seems to me if you keep reducing and removing all of these ergonomic problems and we get to the goal we want to get to, I want to ask us collectively as a community, what happens at that point? And I think you can express it and say this is the Turing test threshold for alternative realities. And I'm a little concerned that I do want a bit of discomfort associated with alternative realities because I want to be able to be pretty sure when I get back to this reality that this is the reality I'm getting back to. So the normal idea of ergonomists is to reduce discomfort, to take away the problems and the issues. But I just ask us as a community to be a little bit aware of the fact that some of those discomforts are actually markers of reality. And I've been concerned a little bit more as I was in a recorded conversation with Sheridan yesterday on what connotes markers of reality. So those are my observations. I found it extremely interesting. I strongly recommend that in order to continue the international conversation, we somehow get hold of somebody meaningful at Meta. Some of us must know somebody there and say, here, you guys, here, bring these people together after the pandemic, bring them together in a single room, have your people come in and fire questions. But if you don't do this, you are rolling the dice without actually thinking too much about the future. And my guess is a lot of their engineers, maybe even they subcontracted out, don't really think in these terms. They just think, we will build it, they will come. And if Kay is right, at least 1% of them will be sick. And usually those are the people who get on Yelp the fastest. So just some observations there.
So, okay, I don't know if you have like any other insights based on what Peter said.
Hey, spot on, Peter. And in terms of the reversing spectacles or prism effect, that's exactly what we're dealing with here. And the point that Peter made that eventually, you had the reversing prism and you saw the world upright, that's actually what we want to figure out is, and also the important thing is to know that at that point, typically people could seamlessly go back and forth. And so that's really what we need to be able to figure out is how do people seamlessly go back and forth. And, overall, in terms of accessibility, if we don't figure these things out from an engineering perspective, or which is both the hardware and the software, we know we're going to drive accessibility limitations, and it's just not okay that some people can do it and some people can't, especially in the enterprise. I don't care about gaming. The people making money care about gaming. I care about the enterprise and when it affects people's livelihoods and jobs. And right now, there are big hurdles in the way of that open accessibility.
Although gaming is already one of the big things for VR. So I don't know if we are getting back at Jean-Marie's data, for instance, with the ANSES report. Jean-Marie, would you say that, do you know which population is at risk? So which one we should concentrate on? For instance, you talked about the children. Obviously, we don't have a lot of studies with children, right? Because we are not including them in a lot of studies. So would you say it's the priorities would be to have a few studies with children relating to gaming, for instance, or?
Yeah, I think that regarding the study, well, first, I fully support the different proposals by Peter, and I think that it would be interesting to continue this international collaboration on the topics. Regarding the children, actually, we have not so much data for ethical reason, mostly. However, in the working group, we had doctors in pediatrics and specialists on the various dimension of development from much more physiological and biological viewpoint. And so, for example, we know that the development of the visual system and can be analyzed in terms of steps. And for example, for 3D, the equilibration between the visual and equilibrium systems is around 10 years. So it means that before we have no idea of what would be the consequences of being highly exposed to incongruence for children. So this is why children are a priority. They are still in development for most of the different components. Actually, the body is developing until 20 or 21 years. So it means that we are still in development. Another point, which is much more on the toxicity of light, is regarding the fact that the lens is completely transparent for children, so that they are much more susceptible to blue light, and they are much more susceptible also to the disruption of circadian rhythm, etc. So I think that the first priority would be the children. After that, I think that, and I completely agree, it depends on the individual susceptibility, on the technological characteristics of the devices, and for example, as shown by Kay Stanney, the IPD, which is it's quite surprising. We are in 2021 and we still find this type of problem of the devices. Well, biomechanical aspect of devices are known for 20, 30 years. It's incredible, actually. So it depends also on the characteristic of the devices, but also on the content and the type of task. So we cannot have general rules for adults. We have to consider in which context, for which people, and for which task. The last point is that since I've been immersed in virtual reality since 20 years, I think it's very cool. It's a nice technology. We can do a lot of things that we dreamed when we were young and so on. But we have also to think of what is the aim of the system. In particular, when we are working on vocational situations, is it possible to have a limitation of accessibility? For example, it means that for some people they couldn't work, they could not work in this task if we use virtual reality. So there are a lot of much more, I would say, organizational and regulation aspect beyond the technology, because when you are limiting the access to some profession, to some vocational situation, it means that you are putting some part of the people out of the job, and we have to find the good solution and to examine the alternative to virtual reality or to augmented reality. Sometimes there's no alternatives, but sometimes there could be alternatives, and I think that human factors in this context should be also considered. And
yeah, so I was seeing Mode reacting to that. I don't know at the CNXR what you are trying to do right now for. It's more at the French level, but I know that you have also peers at the European level. So I don't know what's going on those issues.
Yeah, sure. So what we try to do in a political level, so basically the CNXR is a federation of XR association in various fields. So there is gaming, production content, enterprise, research, scientific. So we try to be all together and to have weekly meetings to take the temperature about the French industry and those questions. On the other side, we have contacts at the government and even at Meta France and many companies like that. And we try to raise those problematic. So either on sustainability or this discomfort or many topics like this, because we believe like you that Meta, they could do some things. For example, in 20 seconds, they can know who you are simply by the captures and how you move your head. So as you said, Jean-Marie, they could totally block it for a kid. If they see your height is too small or anything, it could block the content somehow. So all this regulation and political level of this, we are trying to be active on it with the CNXR at the French level / European level. But as Meta is an American company, it's always so we have some steps. So I know the French Meta person, and I've spoken with some American Meta person, but the time to reach the person who's really powerful in the company and who's willing to make the change is a challenge. And that's why I strongly believe also in European regulations, because they forced Facebook for the LGPD, they forced American companies to adapt some laws to be capable to succeed in Europe. So rather than speaking with Meta, I believe that speaking with Europe would be more efficient. Think, okay, we need to forbid this from Meta, this and that from all the headset providers, and that could work somehow. Because I believe the same as you, even though I'm a content creator agency with Room, we need to create content that makes sense, that are accessible, that are not just here for nothing, that are not just polluting for nothing. So cultural content are sometimes seen as unnecessary, but they are necessary to broadcast culture somehow. But we need to do it the proper way. So at the CNXR level, we are very keen to be surrounded by scientific people telling us those measures we should take into account. But of course, in the headset industry, I believe they are not so keen to have us speaking with them.
Yeah, that's one of the problems we have, because obviously it's American companies or Chinese companies right now that are building the headsets. Although we have one company building a headset right now in France, so maybe they will listen. But at the same time, if Mark listened to us, I contacted some of your engineers, but they're not answering. So I see a few key points from our early discussion. So obviously we will try to keep it going and try to find funds, and as scientists we need to. But I know also that a lot of you are working with companies, so maybe every time we are making a project, even if it's just making a new software or anything like that, maybe assessing side effects will be a good idea. So to begin with, just to gather more data and sharing those data in open access.
Can I suggest a strategic issue here? I think Maud brought up a very interesting problem, is that regulations tend to be seen as negative. one of the ways of not circumventing that, but one of the ways of turning that to an advantage is to suggest to the contributing organizations, and especially those who are manufacturers and purveyors, that they generate their own overarching advisory group that then interacts with those other groups. So in the United States, there is a particular group for the sustenance of electricity, even though there are 40 to 50 different electricity companies. And in reaction to the threat by the federal government to generate such an organization, because obviously the lights have to stay on, otherwise the government doesn't stay in power, as it were, they allowed the companies to create this consortium. So what I suggest to you, Alexis, is when you start to bring those people together, suggest, look, you could generate your own consortium that then could have reasonable dialogue with all of those people who are talking about regulations. So it's not an adversarial situation. It's more like a discussion situation in which, again, you suggest that the science be appointed as the arbiter between them. Obviously, they have different motivations, and that's fine. But if we can appear as the central scientific arbiter within that process, I think we should be able to generate things like data-based accounts of why X is preferable to Y, and then discussions as to their own particular motivations. So I think we need to obviate the idea of regulation as a negative, and then suggest it's actually sort of a positive commercial advantage to be part of this group. And again, if more does have linkages with folks at Metaverse and a variety of other organizations, I think suggesting that to them is a more benign way of them delivering sort of things. But as I understand it, even though I'm in Florida right now, I understand Britain is now not part of Europe anymore. And so I'm sure they will have their own rules and regulations, which will be arcane and involve things like roast beef, I believe you French would say. So anyway, just a suggestion strategically.
Yeah, I don't know what you think about that, Kay. If you are aware of any type of consortium like this, because I know you've been working with Microsoft or other big companies like that. So.
I mean, I think the most collaborative thing we've done is the UL Underwriter Laboratory standards that we're pulling together, where there was a lot of industry participation, and definitely different approaches from different companies. Some were very into addressing these concerns, and others were very into putting everything in the addendum because who needs to worry about it anyway. And so it was interesting, the dichotomy, but those who were advocates for addressing these, pushed hard to get consideration of these kind of concerns. And one of the things that Peter brought up, or no, I think Jean-Marie brought up, was the age issue. And everybody's doing the same thing, which is the headset manufacturers have said under 13, because that's basically when the visual system starts to stabilize. And we don't have the data, and we really don't know the impact on children. And there's a lot of room, there's a lot of room for concern. We know that children are more susceptible to seizures. We know their IPDs are going to be smaller like women. We know that their binocular vision is unstable. There's so many things that make children vulnerable to the adverse physiological effects. We also know that while they may adapt really quickly to these displays, there's a lot of data to suggest the after effects will dissipate more slowly in children. So, with children, we don't have a good handle on the effects, but we also know that they're using them regularly. I don't know anybody, probably everyone in the room probably knows kids who have these VR displays and use them every day. So, long-term effects, will it affect their visual development if they start really young? We don't know these things. And even in the standards group that I work with, we basically said under 13, these standards don't apply. And so nobody's really capturing that space and the safety concerns and the long-term effects. So I think that is a place where we're who are really hurting for knowledge, and we just don't have it. We have tried in the past to get studies like that through, and the liability is just too high, and we just can't. So I think there was one study in Europe, which is probably the most, but it is a subjective study, and there were a handful of kids, and there's a report out on that y'all probably have, but I haven't found anything beyond that. So yeah, that's a big gap. But the Underwriter Laboratory did bring together a number of the high profile companies, and they're at least aware of the problems. Some of them want to address them, some of them don't.
Okay, so yeah, I think we are about out of time right now, but yeah, it was just the workshop was about meeting each other, trying to see what are the main issues we are facing and what we can do about it. So on the roadmap, I would say, yeah, knocking more at the door of the big tech industries. Obviously, this is why I'm in California. Hopefully, I will get in at some point to have them at least make a statement out of it, like telling us if they are ready for forming that kind of consortium Peter was talking about. I would like you to share your slides if it's possible. I don't know if we will put it on the ACM proceedings or not. I don't know yet. One of the organizers will tell me that. So what I will try to do at my level is keep contact with all of you and try to organize something maybe more, how to put that, like real, and maybe try to put some industrials on the table as well. I'm sure you already done it, all of you, at several times in your career, but maybe try to raise the issue of, if the metaverse should come on the table, that those are already all the problems you're facing. So let's try to address them first. Let's see if a metaverse is possible for the human factor aspects, let's say. That's it. Thank you for your time. I think the physical conference has a coffee break right now. So, but I think we are about on time, despite our we were late before. So yeah, I will keep all of you in touch. Obviously, the one that participated or were in the audience and couldn't talk, maybe if you want to reach me and participate to the things that will come after that, because really my purpose here was to show the level of knowledge we have currently about the ergonomic risks, basically, of AR, VR, and try to have people working together. So let's hope we can do that later.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alexis.
Bye.
Bye.
I didn't say that, but for those of you that are interested, later on we have a session on environmental impacts as well. But some already disconnected. Je peux pas t'entendre, Indira. Je pense que.
Est-ce que là tu m'entends?
Oui.
Est-ce qu'on peut couper les speakers de la salle? Alors je reparle. Tu m'entends bien, Alexis?
Je t'entends.
D'accord. Et ça veut dire que c'est moi qui dois t'écouter sur mon smartphone. Est-ce que tu peux parler?
Je parle à cet instant. Je ne sais pas si tu entends bien.
Ouais, alors je t'entends sur mon smartphone. Voilà. C'est ça, on a trouvé. Merci beaucoup. À tout à l'heure.
Bien. À tout à l'heure. Merci.
Yes. Yes, because we cut the speakers of the room, so we can hear by the microphone here, and then we have to switch on the speakers because the Larsen is okay.
Bonjour Guillaume, si tu veux, on peut tester ton micro. Je t'entends, donc il a l'air de fonctionner.
Allô?
Oui, oui. Mais tu n'entends pas, c'est ça?
Ah si.
On attend un petit peu que des personnes arrivent sur la conférence physique qui sont en pause café. C'est pour ça que je te parle en français.
Ok. Là, on m'entend correctement avec le micro du PC? Ouais.
Ouais. Ouais.
Ok.
D'ailleurs, je ne sais pas si on voit le partage de présentation correctement.
En tout cas, moi, je vois une image là, enfin, Web3D, ACM SIGGRAPH, 27e conférence
Magnifique.
internationale.
Très bien. Donc ça veut dire que ça fonctionne. Ouais, on va attendre que les personnes. Je ne sais pas s'il y a des personnes à la conférence physique qui vont arriver, s'il y aura masse de personnes ou pas. Je ne pense pas, on est une dizaine, hein, c'est un petit workshop dans une conférence internationale, donc c'est très restreint. Mais le but, c'est plutôt que on va dire un moment d'échange après les présentations et que on se parle de ce qu'on va faire après. Et là, je me rends compte que c'est encore en train d'enregistrer. Mais il y aura probablement des cuts qui seront faits. Donc les échanges sont enregistrés. A priori, je pense que ce sera publié d'ici quelques mois après sur le site de l'éditeur SIM. Donc voilà.
Ok.
Je n'ai pas de garantie de ça. J'admets ne pas avoir posé de question. Mais généralement, ce qui se passe lors des workshops, on publie les présentations et il y a effectivement des captures vidéo qui sont fournies avec, histoire que tu le saches.
Ok. Et quand on parle de présentation, c'est les personnes qui vont parler, mais moi, par exemple, ce sera dans un second temps, c'est bien ça?
Tout à fait, ce sera pendant la table ronde. De toute façon, l'idée vraiment,
Ah, là, c'est coupé, par contre, le micro.
c'est moi qui ai réappuyé. Oui, là, comme il s'agit d'une table ronde au sein d'une conférence de scientifiques, c'est plutôt pour ouais, informer les quelques personnes du côté scientifique qui seraient intéressées sur le sujet et surtout qui voudraient mettre la main à la pâte, en fait, concrètement. Donc, et je pense que lors de la table ronde, oui, toi, tu pourras éventuellement parler des informations que tu as déjà du côté jeux vidéo et ce que ça implique pour le métaverse lié à ta tribune, en fait. Ce que je vais faire pas plus tard que dans quelques minutes, en fait, aussi, hein. Parler de tout ce qu'on sait sur le reste et absolument ce qu'on sait pas sur le métaverse.
Ok.
Et donc, ouais, faut voir l'exercice comme étant quelque chose qui va être enregistré et potentiellement qui pourra avoir une audience plus large après, comparé à l'audience au sein d'une conférence scientifique. On avait une table ronde précédente sur les aspects sanitaires et un des très grands chercheurs du domaine en ergonomie et en psychologie cognitive disait que le meilleur moyen d'avoir une information qui est bien enterrée, c'est le publier dans un journal scientifique. Donc, je pense que ça s'applique aussi aux conférences scientifiques. Mais je vais attendre que, ouais, je crois qu'il y a un des organisateurs qui, quand il reviendra devant son PC, ça voudra dire qu'a priori, c'est le bon moment pour commencer. Et en espérant que ouais, des parties seront coupées, qu'il y aura un minimum de montage sur la capture vidéo. Sinon, c'est le moment de saluer ta famille, les personnes, tes proches. Ça. Je dirais effectivement que la pause café est terminée, puisque quelques personnes commencent à revenir. Tu sais, Indira, quand est-ce que on doit commencer? Je sais même pas si mon son est activé. Ah si, je crois que c'est. Alors, je pense que c'est pas le moment de commencer, puisque les mecs de l'IT sont pas encore là.
Alexis, tu nous entends? Peut-être qu'on va pouvoir reprendre.
C'est un oui. Ok, on est parti.
Ok, c'est parti, très bien.
All right. So, hello everyone. Welcome to the workshop and roundtable about the environmental effects of what we are calling the metaverse. I will start with the presentation. Maybe I will introduce myself before that because that will be relevant. I'm a Fulbright invited scholar at the University of Southern California in the Institute of Creative Technologies. So I'm a postdoc there. I'm primarily working on cognitive ergonomics, but as you will see, I'm getting interested into the environmental impacts of what we're calling right now the metaverse. And what I'm going to talk about is mostly the state of ignorance relative to the environmental impacts of this metaverse. To begin with, let's talk about the planetary boundaries, kind of the general issues there. So humanity is currently operating outside the planetary boundaries, and 5 out of the 9 boundaries have been transgressed already. So I will go very, very fast on those, but we keep on increasing the novel entities production, such as chemicals, plastics, that are interesting for a metaverse. If we take those plastics and chemicals, we see the projection, so we'll just keep increase no matter if there is a metaverse or not. So we also see that human activities are disturbing the normal biochemical cycles. For instance, for a metaverse, we will need water. That will be interesting. We already went beyond what is considered a safe land system change. So for instance, we had a lot of forest loss, and globally we use too much space as human beings. So yeah, once again, I'm going very fast on those. So humanity's activities are causing what we're calling the 6th mass extinction. The latest estimate by the WWF shows a decrease of 69% between 1970 and 2018 for most animals on the planet. And at the current rate, we will reach 1.5 degrees Celsius more in 2040. So we have less than 10 years to limit our just global emissions. And so it's just to limit it to 2 degrees above the 19th century average, basically. And yeah, so those are the projections with the current policies or with the business as usual. So even with the current policies, we see that by the end of the century, we might be at more than 3 degrees increase. And it has a lot of implications. I will not list them here, but the United Nations are just showing everything that will go wrong if we go there. And so just a summary about that is that humanity keeps operating outside the planetary boundaries without significant inflections, and most living beings' current and future existence are threatened, including humans, within the next decades and the following centuries. Yet we miss a lot of data, especially because everything is very complex when we talk about environment. But we need to assess how much our field, so the information communication technologies, is participating to operating outside the planetary boundaries and try to fix it if we can. And talking about ICTs, we know that it's contributing at operating outside the planetary boundaries. So if we take estimations of the global emissions of ICTs, we can tell that it's about 2.9 or well, yeah, it's between 2.9 and 2.1, sorry, and 3.9% of the total emissions. But if we keep things with a business as usual, basically, it can be as much as 14% of all emissions. And interestingly, data center seems to be the segment participating the most to the GHG emissions. ICTs, especially hardware, when not used anymore, mainly become waste, and that waste is already expected to increase, though, even if we are not adding headsets. The more ICTs, the more CO2 emissions. So we have a causal effect here. It's notably linked to the crafting of the devices, but also the electricity consumption, and depending on what is the primary energy used to create this electricity. And as for now, it's mainly still carbon sources, basically. We have a few projections when it comes to ICTs, and we see that most projections are showing that it will increase. And once again, it's not even considering a metaverse. And what's interesting as well is we don't calculate the rebound effects, so we're very bad at understanding what other environmental impacts it could have later on. And once again, here in summary, ICTs and just electronics environmental impacts are poorly evaluated, and tech companies go little through life cycle assessments, for instance, or for the products or services. So we mostly have access to estimates, and those estimates show that ICTs should increase their environmental footprint. Now, in that context, we are having billions that are used to try and build what we call the metaverse. We have plenty of definitions of the metaverse, so I will just say that much. A metaverse will be a real-time, persistent, multi-layered, and networked 3D world, partially to fully immersive. We do have Wang and colleagues that proposed a definition, and we also have more of a used definition by Chen colleague this year. So I looked at the scientific literature about the environmental impacts of the metaverse with its associated technologies, VR, AR, MR. I excluded blockchain though, and only one article out of all the database I searched was going out. So basically, it's one article that is trying to assess a VR device life cycle. So and this paper is not very clear on which units they used or not, and but that tells how much we know right now scientifically about specifically the technologies related to a metaverse. So we have to start to think here. So what we call the metaverse requires hardware and will be a very material virtual world, basically. First, the user's hardware it's primarily the headset and the controllers, right, and a few batteries. But of course, you have to consider the companies that are developing their software. To do so, they mainly rely on data centers, and they need their own hardware, their computers, their headsets to test their softs. Therefore, we have to think about the factories that are behind that are building the hardware and shipping them. And finally, of course, the infrastructures. And I'm not yet considering the primary resources we would need. But if we just focus on the assets, that will be the primary way of accessing a metaverse. Just obviously the projections are showing that we will ship more assets in the years to come. And those headset components are coming from somewhere, and that's the view of what's inside some current headsets, thanks to iFixit. So as you can see, it's the same for the controllers here. So we have primary plastics and metals. And what we see is that the projections are already showing we will have increased demand, and we will have increased wastes basically on those materials. The headsets imply more printed circuit boards, more semiconductors, and more batteries, which production is already expected to increase. Of course, as well, more lenses. We're not thinking about that, but so all the graphs here are just showing exactly the same thing. Everything is increasing. So what we can tell is that most basic materials and components necessary to build headsets are projected to have an increased production, revenues, and demand with the associated environmental impacts. With a metaverse, we would likely accentuate and amplify the stress on those resources and complexify other vital transformations necessary to meet Paris 2016 agreements, because they're counting on those resources as well. If we focus on the software part of what would be a metaverse, we have no data for machine or deep learning that will be necessary to to just adapt the environments, the data centers necessary for computation or storage and the production of the software itself. Focusing on data centers currently creating the highest emissions, as we saw previously on ICTs, we see they are already predicted to increase their footprint. And once again, it's not even considering a metaverse, but yeah, I found it interesting to just talk about the data centers, because obviously we would need a lot of them for a metaverse. And what you are seeing on the graphs is just graph data extracted from the literature, showing all the different models trying to project how much will be the GHG footprint of the data centers in the years to come. So I went very, very fast, but what I tried to do is to get a number, because basically what I said right now is obvious, and we don't know much, but we have a few studies that are trying to assess the global GHG emissions for other devices, and we have an example with the smartphones. So we all like general numbers. I've taken the Berkshire and Alexis 2018 assessment for smartphones that are considering the smartphone itself, so the device itself, but also the data centers and the communication networks it requires. And they are getting a number in megatonnes of equivalent CO2. So I just reused that to a little thought experiment. And that thought experiment is as following. So I assumed that one headset is equivalent to 2 smartphones, just because it has 2 screens, and 2 smartphones from 2020 in CO2 equivalent. So I also assumed that a metaverse would double down the data centers and communication networks that are necessary. So it's just a simple multiplication by 2 of what a smartphone is, basically. And also, I consider it will take the same time as smartphones to reach the same number of units. Basically, it took about 20 years for having 80 to 90% people having a smartphone in Western countries. So I'm assuming it will be exactly the same thing. And obviously, there are big differences between a smartphone and a headset, or what a metaverse would be. We are not facing the same males because the screens are not tactical. We don't use our digits on the screen, sorry. In a headset, you have to consider that there is more plastic, there are more cameras, the controllers also, and obviously and hopefully in 2040 the energy mix will change. So the electricity will maybe more coming from nuclear plants or renewable energies. It's also not considering that 3D files and AI for optimization will require a large amount of computing and storage, and also that with a headset we will probably generate way more data than what we have with a smartphone already. So anyway, what I came out with is that by 2040, metaverse will represent about 778 megatons of equivalent CO2 a year. So it's from the resources, so from the primary resources to the extraction to the waste. So we have the headsets themselves that will be 250 megatons, and the infrastructures around it will be 528 megatons. So just to give you a representation of what those emissions are relating to other things we know. Sorry. So for instance, a metaverse in 2040 will be more emissions than Iran in 2020. And Iran was the 6th worst in the world when it comes to GHG emissions in 2020. So it's just to give you an idea of the scales we are talking about. So I went very fast, but let's sum up. One, we don't know, and we can't really calculate the metaverse future environmental impact. This is very concerning news with the current trends of exceeding planetary boundaries. Projections show that ICTs will negatively impact the environment with the current production conditions and use. Basically, the business as usual will be a problem for a metaverse. And we have little to no proofs that shows that the field is committing to reducing those impacts, except by pledging. So we're pledging a lot of reducing our impacts, but it's not shown in the numbers yet, in the data. And hence a metaverse would follow the same trend, and it's already following the same trend with the headsets we are creating and the software we are creating. The current development of hardware and software that could make a metaverse possible implies an increase in the operating outside the planetary boundaries with everything I explained before. And if it doesn't factually change the other GHG emissions, so basically less plane, for instance, more energy consumption, metal extraction, plastic production can be envisioned. And for the hardware, software, and the infrastructures, companies must do a life cycle assessment. We'll have Mark talking about how we can do that and how it's done. And also, one very important thing is communicating the data. Basically, right now, if the data exists, we barely know it because they're not shared. Since we are in the Web3D conference, we are mostly talking about XR stakeholders, maybe a lot of engineers or computer scientists that are making a metaverse possible. So I think that what we need to do, and this is my attempt, well, the first attempt with that kind of workshop and roundtable, is federate and try to work at assessing what we're calling now the metaverse environmental impacts. And there are a lot of people we can join that are already doing that or communicating about it. So I want to get back at that. It's just a thought experiment, but if we make all the assumptions that a metaverse is 2 times a smartphone plus its infrastructures from 2020, it will represent an enormous CO2 equivalent emission for a metaverse to exist in 2040, for example. So it will be basically an entire new country that we're adding. Of course, it's a figure of speech. It's not exactly that, but it's just for giving the proportions here and the scale we are talking about. And that's about it. I took 20 minutes. Fantastic. So, of course, you have the references here. And just since I have 2-3 minutes left, you can, for instance, join Boavista if you are in France. They are working on those issues. And if you are in Europe, you can try to join the Sustainable Digital Infrastructure Alliance. I just recently joined them. So, yeah, and obviously, since AR and VR is not as common as other techs now, very few people are working on that, but we already have a lot of people working on the data center aspects of things. And this is exactly what Mark will talk about after. So it's everything for me. Thank you. So I don't know if you have any questions, and if you don't have any questions, we will keep going and we will have Mark doing his presentation. Oh, we can't hear you.
Alexis, also, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. So I can, there you go. That's the question has just been answered now. I can now share my screen. I was just going to say I didn't have it was all grayed out. So
Okay.
thank you to whoever fixed that.
Perfect.
1 second and I will share my screen for you.
Perfect. And in the meantime, I will enter Nicholas. Is there any value in estimating the travel savings? I looked for it, but no, nothing exists. What I can tell is that plane traveling, it's already something very hard to find because we have only commercial emissions of flights mostly. So it's hard to tell. But it wouldn't be just a simple subtraction, right? So it's not because it's saving emissions on not taking the plane or the car that it doesn't mean that the metaverse itself will be a problem. But it's hard to tell. This is exactly the kind of questions I'm asking myself as well, and we don't have a lot of data allowing us to make that kind of calculations. And I can see your screen, Mark.
Brilliant.
So I think that I will just introduce you, and then the floor will be yours. So it's my pleasure to introduce Mark Butcher. And tell me if I'm wrong when I'm presenting you, by the way. Mark is a sustainable IT and cloud expert, currently director at Positive Clouds, a consulting company based in London. And he's a member of the Sustainable Digital Infrastructure Alliance. It's a European NGO. Yeah, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you, everyone. So yeah, so as was just said, so I run a consulting company, and one of the things that we do is we have a huge focus on the term which is now becoming more popular, which is green ops, which if you break that down, it's all about digital sustainability, and it's all about helping people do things better. And which when you come to things like the metaverse, which has the potential to be absolutely huge from an IT and environment perspective, it's very important that we take the opportunities very early now to looking at how things are built from the perspective of sustainability, how the services are run, and importantly, I as well looking at the upstream positive impact that can be had from running services in the metaverse. But bringing it back to sort of a fairly more prosaic type side of things, it's important to understand within the world of kind of enterprise IT, awareness of sustainability is actually at a fairly low point in most organizations at a corporate level. And what I mean by corporate level, I obviously mean sort of the C-suite around digital emissions. There's been a general lack of understanding as to their size and scale and the potential impact, and they've been ignored for a very long time as big enterprises have focused more on what they consider to be their easier wins or their larger impacts. So things around buildings and transport and that side of things. But suddenly over the last year to 18 months, there's been a growing awareness that all these gigantic data centers and all these huge cloud services that are being consumed have a absolutely vast potential impact. And no one really understands what that impact is because it hasn't been very well measured, either by the vendors, the providers, or by the consumers. And there is a huge, and if you go within the borders of IT and you go inside the IT organizations, there is a real lack of understanding of what digital sustainability is or what sustainability is, how it's measured, and very importantly, the size and scale of the impact. And what that means is that as everyone have got sort of dived down the path of building everything digitally, for transforming everything, for modernizing things, for adopting cloud services, there had been a tendency for a long time for particularly the largest organizations to assume that if they were using something like a managed service or a cloud service, that it wasn't their problem. It was someone else's problem. Someone else was fixing it. And luckily, with changing in legislation, that understanding is rapidly shifting. And for me personally, I've seen that since COP26, where suddenly the big CEOs who made a lot of, and you have to excuse it, the virtue signaling promises around net zero, when they made them, the dates they committed to seemed a long, long way away. That's different now. Those dates are now looming. So people are now suddenly looking at 2030 and 2035 and even 2040 and saying, well, actually, we can't delay anymore. We've actually got to do something. And the interesting point that I'm seeing is that even at some C-suite levels, bonuses and targets are being defined specifically around, are you going to achieve your net zero target? So it's no longer enough just to create a target and throw it out to your HR team and say, go on, can you print a brochure and run a few pizza parties for the team to talk about it? They're actually now being measured. You've got investors measuring them. You've got at every angle, you've got customers making buying decisions based upon it. And you've got employees deciding who they go and work for. So there is within IT, there's suddenly a shift from kind of the disregarding it going up to the kind of the base compliance level, which is doing the bare minimum. But suddenly what's refreshing to see is that they're looking going, well, actually, we now know we've realized we've got a big scale, but we don't know where to start. We don't know how to measure it. We don't really understand what the emissions are, but we know we've got to get somewhere. We've got to start looking at where we are. And I know this is very overly simplistic, this example. This is, within the boundaries of IT, and if you're looking at Metaverse, a lot of those platforms are built obviously on the cloud services, but it's looking at data centers, infrastructure, and end user compute implications. It's definitely looking at cloud services, but the software development processes, standards, and approach is massively important. But the bit that absolutely can't be forgotten is that sustainability within enterprise IT, and particularly in new generation IT, so cloud native platforms, is more about the people than it actually is about the technology. Because if you don't get your strategy and culture right across the organization when it comes to sustainability, you won't really impact any changes. And what I mean by that is that it has to be everyone's job. It's not just one person's job. It's a shift. It's moving away from having one person asking what people are doing and then reporting on it. It's looking at questioning everything we do. And that's everything from the bit we've always done is we've started at the back end and we've measured it and we've said we need to reduce a thing. So, leaving it to the FinOps teams, which is the financial cloud cost management teams, and expecting them to make the savings and to implement the changes. But you can't do that unless the rest of the IT environment and the line of business is actually on board with wanting to make the changes. Because by the time you're trying to reduce waste and eliminate things and right size things, it's almost too late because it's already happened. So the biggest point about focusing is that we need to be looking at how do we make sustainability within our entire ecosystem a completely embedded thing? How do we get it as a non-functional requirement across all aspects of IT? And that's everything from when you originally define your requirements in the first place from a business perspective, before they even hit the borders of IT for platforms and services to be developed. And when you are developing them, simple things like, and what is your DevOps process? Is it a sustainable process? Have you got the right metrics in place? Have you got the right processes in place? Even something as prosaic as saying, is the language we're using the right language to be using? Is it a sustainable language? Will it deliver the value you want? And then it's looking at things like data centers and saying, even if you're using a cloud service, that's still something in someone's data center somewhere. It doesn't really matter. It's just someone else's computer. So you need to be looking at the locations. You need to be working out, is it the right place to be using your services? And then from an infrastructure perspective, it might seem very obvious, but is the infrastructure the most sustainable infrastructure? And simple things like, are you pulling all the levers you can from your perspective? So if you're running it in your data centers, are you looking at doing things like pulling the levers to extend the life cycle? Are you selecting your infrastructure in, say, hardware, so servers, storage arrays, that kind of thing, which are a huge part of the emissions? Are you selecting them from the right types of vendors? And then that applies also to the cloud services as well, because the cloud vendors, which I'll come on to later, they make a great virtue signaling job of saying that they're green and they're sustainable. And you have to question yourself sometimes, are they? Because the average cloud data center is monumentally different to any kind of data center you probably would have seen before. Yes, they are run efficiently, but these things are consuming power and they're consuming water like it's going out of fashion. So I mean, the average cloud data center consumes more water on a daily basis than the average city, and a lot of people don't realize that, and it's suddenly starting to impact society. Where if I look at, say, London, from where my company's based, we're starting to see big developments that can't happen simply because there isn't enough water available, there isn't enough power available. So it is a sustainability impact, but it's also a societal impact. So I thought it was important to actually look at things like some really simple things if you go within IT. So this is, I'm going to go through a couple of quick questions that I delivered a while ago. So this is not a very scientific study. It was delivered to around about 150 CIOs and CTOs of large enterprise organizations. And so what you'll see here is some very common trends and themes. So over half of them have been asked by their business to calculate their digital carbon emissions, which is great. But the problem with that actually was that 71% of them didn't actually know the difference between emissions or what it actually meant. So they were being asked to measure something that they didn't actually understand themselves. So then the next question was, have you actually attempted to calculate it then? Have you actually done it? So you've been asked by your business to do it, but have you actually done it? And 58% of people hadn't actually done it or didn't know. And you'd have to assume that if they didn't know whether they'd done it or not, they very clearly hadn't done it and just didn't want to say so. And then it comes down to, would you actually know where to start? And a massive 76% of people in the survey had no idea where they might want to start. And the general answer from them was, we'll ask our vendors or we'll ask facilities. They had no idea how to measure it, how to report on it, or where to actually start. Which then came into, are you actually monitoring your emissions today? And the general answer being, no, we're not. So 78% of them actually aren't doing anything. And these are organisations where the reason why I chose these organisations was 100% of them had a net zero target as organisations, and 100% of them had a massive investment in IT and IT services, most typically spending anything. The average size of spend on cloud services for these organisations was between $150 million a year and $1.5 billion a year. So substantial investment in cloud services, and they all had somewhere between 5 and 100 data centres as well. But the good thing was that even though they weren't actually monitoring carbon emissions, they did believe they should be tracking carbon emissions, which is a somewhat strange thing. So what's holding people back? And I think I heard it towards the end of Alexis's presentation. There's lack of data is a major issue when it comes to IT and sustainability. And lack of data isn't just the kind of the simple data that you might think. It's also even having a consistent way that data is calculated. Because when we talk about things like life cycle analysis and product carbon data sheets for infrastructure or cloud services, the problem you have is that a lot of the vendors are calculating everything in different ways, and they're being very selective about what they include and what they don't include. So it is a real challenge for a lot of IT organizations to baseline something when they're not confident about the data they're getting and they're not sure what's being included and excluded. I'm sure you all know this very, very well, but just a very simplistic example from the context of what are digital emissions? Just breaking it very simply into the 3 scopes. Scope 1 is actually quite small generally from an IT perspective, but it is emissions from the combustion of diesel fuel. Scope 2 is the one that everyone focuses love and attention on, which is the lovely power one. Everyone talks about power related emissions, and there's been a bit of an obsessive focus on that. And scope 3 is the bit that it almost falls into what I would call the too hard pile. And what I mean by that is it's the emissions from everything else, and it's extremely complicated. But the problem is actually it's quite big, particularly within the world of IT. So if you look at how these things are kind of built up, it's a very obvious diagram, and apologies if this is very basic for you, but you have to look at it from the context of almost being like the stacking dolls building up here, in that you get to the second one from the right there, which is effectively that will be where your data center sits, the servers you're buying, the storage you're buying, or importantly, the cloud service that you're consuming. And so all the emissions for you flow down the entire supply chain. And that's where the problem we have today is all the companies trying to calculate their emissions in different ways. And I'm not going to go through this in a huge amount of detail, but this is scope 3 from an IT perspective. It's the biggest problem because it's much bigger than anyone thought it would be. There's a fantastic study that Microsoft released. They wrote a white paper on it not that long ago, where they finally went through the process of auditing their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for Microsoft Azure, so their public cloud service. What they found was that it was more than 77% of their emissions fell into scope 3. So they'd focused all their attention before on scope 1 and 2, but actually they found that scope 3 was way, way bigger than they anticipated, because it's because it includes so many things. And the problem with scope 3 is it is complicated to calculate, but you can't ignore it. Because if you're serious about building efficient services, sustainable services, and doing something right for the future, because legislation is rapidly going to be hitting us about enforcing the reporting and measurement and auditing of emissions, you're not going to be able to get away with ignoring scope 3. So the key point I would say is you need to start looking now. You need to start making estimates and assumptions wherever you can. and understanding where you have gaps, because it's okay to have gaps as long as you know what those gaps are, and because eventually someone will come knocking asking you for clarification, and it'd be great if you have that available. So going back a little bit then, so if you go into sort of scope 2, this is a really simple example, because when you talk to scope 2 and you talk to, say, cloud providers or data center providers, quite often you hear the refrain that it doesn't matter because we're using renewable energy. Unfortunately, that's not how the electricity grid works. Just because you're buying renewable energy doesn't mean you're consuming renewable energy. What comes out the plug in your data center or your services is actually a blend of whatever is coming out of the grid at that time for the specific location in which you're operating from. This is an example I did for a very nice friendly customer who was very new to this the other week. So they had 2 data centers, one in London and one in East England, it's called. And actually, they're only 10 miles apart. So if you look here, these figures were the carbon intensity of the electricity, which they said was 100% renewable, on the same day at the same time. And so what they hadn't realised was that if they chose to put deploy a service in London on that day, they were creating 37% more emissions than they would if they deployed it in their East of England data centre. They'd never considered that. They never considered the variability, because in their mind, renewable energy meant zero emissions. So they had no problem. They'd done what they needed to do. And suddenly they're looking at it from a completely different context. But then they started to say, well, what about our global locations? And that's when it really gets fascinating, when you start looking at global locations and where you select them. So the figures in this chart here, these are all taken from, they were last Thursday afternoon as a point in time average for the previous 30 days. I chose an average of 30 days so that we could get rid of any anomalies, because one of the things with carbon intensity of electricity, it's so variable and people don't realise how much it varies on a daily basis. It can go 30–40% difference easily on any given day in terms of it. But this is the average. And what you'll see here is locations like Scotland and Sweden, awesome, because they have such a high proportion of actual renewable energy coming out of the grid because of the way they operate, you'll find their emissions are generally very low. And then you go down the other end of the spectrum, and there's some examples there of, say, Australia, which is fairly well known for being fairly dirty in terms of a lot of the power, but even locations you might not expect. So places like Estonia. And then you've got India. And the region I've chosen for India there is southern India. So the areas around kind of Bangladesh. So you can actually see there very clearly. And what that means is that if you're making a decision to build, design, operate and deploy services in a public cloud and they're in any of these locations, that shows how variable your emissions could be. And actually, for years in the data center industry, we have obsessed manically about PUE, so power usage effectiveness. But it's only when you start looking at these stats and you realize actually that location is way more important than the efficiency of the data center. Because if you take this example here, you could put the world's most efficient data center in Estonia, and it would still generate 20 times more emissions than the least efficient data center in the world put in Scotland or Sweden. So you need to be considering and making design and deployment decisions on your services. It enables you to think differently when you start looking at the data from this context, because it's really important not just to look at the figures that the provider gives you, but think about the impact of them and where you build and operate your services. And particularly if you build your services in a way where they can be more portable, you need to be making sustainable decisions when you're deploying these services. So picking regions where actually the average is lower, or automating the process of moving them wherever you can. And this was the example specifically for the for this particular organization. So we chose some boundary locations. So we chose a bad location inside the UK and we chose a good location inside the UK, and we compared it to their 2 locations just to see what it would look like. So as you can see, southern Scotland, the emissions in southern Scotland on that particular example was 16 grams of CO2 at that particular point in time. So we then compared that to South Wales, which is a horrible location in the UK from an energy perspective, and that was 350 grams. So nearly 22 times larger. So just by deploying something in Scotland as opposed to South Wales could have reduced their digital emissions just for scope 2 by a factor of 22, which is a monumental difference. So you'd ask yourself, does this matter? Well, kind of, yes, it really does in terms if you look at the actual scale of it. So you think of the average size of the average Metaverse type style platform. These are big chunky platforms running huge amounts of service and infrastructure. It doesn't matter whether they're in a public cloud or in one of your data centers. there's an awfully large amount of compute resource, storage resource, networking resource that will require a lot of racks and a lot of power. So this was an example for these guys. They had 45 racks in this data center, which was consuming for them about 260 kilowatts of power in a fairly nasty old data center with a PUE of 1.6. And as you can see, if that data center had been in Scotland instead of London, because these were not latency dependent services at all, and the connectivity was absolutely fine, they could have achieved over the previous 3 years a 76% reduction in emissions, which equated to nearly 2.3 million kilograms of CO2. And this was for a very, very simplistic decision. This was not a complicated thing for them to do. This is actually a very low risk, simple decision, which is massively beneficial from a sustainability perspective. But they'd never considered it because in their mind, carbon and electricity, it was all the same no matter where you were. It was a simple point. But this is a shared responsibility because a lot of metaverse projects, as I said, are built in the cloud. And people talk about the cloud being sustainable. And and the truth is that the cloud providers, they do build things as efficiently as they can do. And they don't do it necessarily for the environmental good. They do it because it drives their profitability. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. If profitability and purpose go together and they're aligned, that's probably good because we're more likely to get the result we want. But from the context of how you deliver your services, it's also important that you start thinking from the mind of, it is definitely a shared responsibility model. So the cloud provider or the data center provider, they're responsible for making sure the actual data center facility itself and the services that run in it are procured and built and operated as efficiently as they can be. But you need to think about actually your responsibility as well, because if you look at enterprise IT, unfortunately, it's not the most efficient design service. In most enterprise environments, you'll find if you look at the cloud, the average cloud waste globally is about 40%. And what I mean by cloud waste is simply wasted resources that aren't required. It's oversized servers, oversized instances, it's things that haven't been switched off, like development environments that are running out of hours that could just be terminated, like storage volumes that aren't required, like backups of data that have been kept forever that aren't actually required. So pretty basic stuff. And simple things like DevOps processes where you're not automating things, you're not running things as fast as they could be in terms of development processes. Your cycles are running too often. You've got redundant development test cycles. So it's not having kind of sustainability nailed into you as a non-functional requirement. It's not doing kind of the optimizing cloud consumption and reducing your wastage, having hardened processes in place. It's not having real hard and fast targets that are contextual across your entire environment and linked. And the other point being is that if you're going to have targets, you need to make sure those targets flow upwards as well. So everyone has to feel the pain of having a target, and it needs to be linked in some way into how they're paid. It's looking at things like the code efficiency and the service sizing methodology as well, because there's a lot of conservatism that goes in when we're sizing services. There's a lot of the least risk approach because the perception that the service is so important. We need to make sure that the service is running at, running it or always has the CPU and the RAM that it requires and it can run efficiently. But actually what that ends up with, because you never go looking backwards at decisions made over time, typically, you end up with a lot of aged services running on inefficient platforms that could be optimized very quickly, and which ends up driving your asset utilization down quite a lot. So the point here being is when you're making decisions, don't think of it as being all someone else's responsibility. A huge amount of the waste that creeps in, you could reduce your footprint very easily, most people, by about 40% without even thinking. And that comes down to even like design methodology. So it's things like, do we go serverless technologies? Do we adopt microservices instead of going for full instances? Some fairly simple contextual decision points. And this is the example I gave of the kind of the cloud inefficiencies and waste. And if you want to know the scale of this, the nice thing about digital sustainability is in nearly every case, you will save money if you operate your services sustainably because you'll be consuming fewer resources. And this is particularly true when it comes to the cloud, because the whole point of the cloud is you can switch things on and off when they're required. You can resize things on demand. You can optimize everything that you need, and you can not use what you don't need. Unfortunately, that's generally not the case as to how people actually operate the cloud, which is why the likes of Amazon and Microsoft have grown so fast. And the context of the size of this, so global cloud spend is growing exponentially, even though they said that there's been some stories coming in the press in the last week about revenue growth slowing. They're still going to hit more than $500 billion in revenue this in fiscal year 23. which is throughout the course of this year. And so $500 billion, if you think of the context that 40% of that being waste, that's somewhere around $220 billion of revenue being spent by organizations on services that are not required and add no business value. So when you're looking at how you build and develop your platforms and services, you think what you could do with that money to develop new features and functionality and deliver more value to the business if you had that flowing straight back into your bottom line by being more efficient. You could be bringing in entirely new development teams to deliver the features that you can't currently deliver because you don't have the budget for it. So it's not just about saving money, it's about delivering you the capability to do more by being more sustainable. But there is a problem. So when it comes to the reporting of the carbon footprint, the hyperscalers are not in a particularly fantastic place. And this is really, really important when it comes to the very start of this conversation we went back to, which is the need to report this back into your business and report your carbon footprint. At the moment, if you were a user of the big three public clouds, you could get the figures from them because they all have carbon reporting tools, and they're all in varying levels of inadequacy in terms of what they're doing and how they're reporting them. If I take my worst case example here, which is Amazon AWS. So at the moment, Amazon only include their scope 1, most of their scope 2, and none of their scope 3 in their calculations. And the problem from your context is that as people building services in the public cloud, 100% of the public cloud falls into your scope 3 from a reporting perspective. So the fact that you've got a provider there who's not including their scope 3 means that you're likely going to be missing out 77 to 80% of the emissions that are related to the running of your services. And then it goes slightly further in that Amazon take what's called a market-based approach to the calculations of their scope 2 emissions. And what they mean by that is if they use any form of renewable energy in a region, they zero their emissions. So they will tell you that you are generating zero emissions by using the public cloud in certain regions, which is fundamentally not true if you go back to the context of what I showed you earlier about the data center consumption. And you can't make reasoned decisions with it either, because they group their data. They don't do it at a granular level, so you can't see that one instance is better or worse than another one from a carbon perspective, because they group it at firstly, they do their calculation at the entire country level, so the whole of the US in their region, the whole of EU being a region for them, and they group it into three very aptly named categories: EC2, S3, and other. So the compute, a storage tier, and other being everything else. And they've got about 2,500 other services that they have. So you can't actually make sensible, reasoned decisions. And the other point being is the data they're using is old. So they use an average carbon intensity figure from 3 months before. So actually, if you look at the data, you can't actually make a decision on what you're going to do because it's already something that happened 3 months ago. And they do it based upon averages. So it's messy, horrible, gnarly data that you can't make a decision with. And it's not granular enough for you to use for any reporting, and it excludes most of the emissions. So it's not a great place to be. Microsoft, slightly better. They've put a lot of effort into quantifying their emissions, and they're not perfect, but at least they've got a big team focused on this, and they're trying to drive it forward as fast as they can. So they don't have a carbon data age of 3 months, they have it monthly. But they do calculate it hourly rather than monthly that Amazon do. And that's important because it means you can actually see the changes. So if you've got very dynamic systems like you are likely to have in a Metaverse style platform, you can actually see the impact of your emissions in a very granular manner, and you can see anomalies when they happen. So for example, a lot of teams have cost optimization teams looking at anomalies from a cost perspective. So if you had Microsoft, Microsoft Azure resources, you'd actually be able to see anomalies from a carbon perspective as well. So if you suddenly saw your emissions spiking, you could do something about it faster. And they include all of their services inside their reporting, and they do it at a detailed product level as well. But they still calculate the emissions at a cloud region level. But their region being a smaller idea, a region could be the UK or France or the Netherlands. And Google are somewhere in between. So Google have just released an update where they are now starting to include their scope 3. They haven't yet defined how much of their scope 3, but it's only yellow in that chart there because simply it's not yet 100% clear. But their carbon data age is hourly. So what that means is that's a brilliant thing because you can make more reasoned decisions, but they calculate the consumption monthly, which again, it's good from the granularity, but it doesn't enable you to make decisions in real time. And they only include today about 80 of their services, but they are their core services of which generate the most of the usage. And they do give you a detailed product level. So you can see here, the problem you have is that if you have these three providers, if Amazon told you your emissions were, say, 100 tons, and Microsoft told you that your emissions were 700 tons, you might think that Amazon was better than Microsoft. But actually, they could be talking about exactly the same figure. And that's the problem, is that data quality is of such a low thing. You have to know what assumptions you're making, and you have to make decisions at this stage as to where you're going to add in your own factor of safety. So I know a lot of enterprise organizations who are taking the Amazon figures right now, and they're multiplying them by 8. And one of the reasons why they're doing that is also so that as this data does mature and get better, they're not going to be reporting massive spikes in growth in emissions just because data quality is improving. So they're almost trying to take the bad news now and accept it and understand that they'll just get more accurate and they'll be able to reduce that factor of multiple over time. And so I'm not going to go into this in detail at all because I appreciate I'm probably running short of time, I think already. Is that there are so many easy and obvious practical steps from a cloud perspective that you can take. And the table on this page and the one that follows are very much, it comes from a project that we're running in the FinOps Foundation, which is a global foundation focused on cloud cost optimization. And what we're looking at is creating a standard list of remediations that organizations can use that will have a positive impact on sustainability, digital sustainability. And also importantly, what we're looking at is when would you typically find yourself capable of leveraging these remediation steps to introduce efficiency? And what I mean by that is that there's no point trying to ask someone who is relatively low level of maturity in cloud adoption to do something that's very complicated, because it's unlikely to actually stick and it's unlikely to have any benefit. So we're trying to group them by levels of maturity as well and capability, but it's covering everything from optimizing your compute services, optimizing networking. It's looking at your operations to see how you're using things like auto scaling and auto termination. It's looking at ways of transforming the applications you're building to make sure you're building them in the right way, looking at programming languages. It's looking at storage policies and your overarching strategies as well, for including your procurement strategies. So there is an awful lot that you can be doing. And if anyone ever wants to talk about this in much more detail, I'm happy if you want to